All right, hello everybody. So with this unit, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when we read this novel, which is a fantasy novel, we need to make sure that we understand the elements of fantasy literature. What are some things that are actually included in it? And we're also going to be covering some literary devices that you guys need to be aware of throughout the reading. So first we need to talk about common themes in fantasy literature. So we've talked about themes before, but we'll review. Theme refers to the moral message or meaning of a story. If you think about what the author wants you to learn, that's what the theme is. Usually there's some kind of underlying life lesson to be taught, okay? So in fantasy literature, some common themes are good versus evil. So you might have a good character and a bad character, and then they have some kind of struggle between each other. You might have a quest for an ancient relic or something that holds a lot of power, okay, where we have our character going on a quest or a mission to retrieve that. And also, we might have our characters learning about inner self, in relation to the main character, the protagonist. There's something that they're trying to identify within themselves, okay? Some common fantasy literature characteristics may include magic, spells, a quest, a kingdom. So you might have some knights or kings and queens, or a struggle for power. These are just some of the most common things that you will find throughout fantasy literature. We do need to talk about setting. So setting in literature refers to the place and time that a story is taking place. Now, this is really important because what this does, when an author is able to establish clearly when and where the story is taking place, that helps the reader use their imagination and identify where these characters are at. Okay, so for example, in Brian's Winter, the story takes place in the Canadian wilderness during the winter months. That was the last novel that we read. So if we think about the way that Gary Paulsen was describing all of the things in nature that Brian was seeing, maybe even where he was living in his little hut, in his shelter, and all of the things that he was able to see, that was all part of the setting. Okay. So that helps us in our mind to identify when and where the story was taking place. So if we were in class, what I would have you do, I'd have you take a minute and think about your silent reading book or any book that you've read recently. And think about when and where does that story take place. Okay, so even though you can't share with a partner, I want you guys to think about that. Stop and think about maybe the silent reading book that you're currently reading or one that you have read at school before, and think about that, okay? Because that setting is a huge piece for us to identify with the novel, okay? So characters and characterization. So characters, we all know what those are. It could be a person, animal, or object in a story. And when I say object, think of pretty much any Disney movie, okay? If you were thinking of Beauty and the Beast, we have Mrs. Potts. She's a teapot. That's an object, right? She is personified. And if you remember from our poetry unit, personification is when we have an inanimate object that does something that a human would do, okay? The types of characters. We have two main types of characters. The protagonist, which is the good or central character in a novel. And I want you guys to think of the hero. Now, if we look at that word protagonist, we have that prefix pro. And when we think of that prefix pro, we think of something good or something positive. Okay, so that's how I will always remember the protagonist. Okay, the pro, something good. Whereas we have the antagonist, which is the bad character in the novel, who usually causes the protagonist problems. You can think of the villain, okay? Now, when I was a kid, and if my sister and I were arguing, usually it was me. My dad would always say, Melissa, stop antagonizing your sister. So if we think about that word antagonize, that verb, right? When you antagonize somebody, you're annoying them or you're causing them some kind of problem. So that might be a good way for you guys to remember that difference between protagonist and antagonist. So in fantasy literature, we do have some common characters that you might see or be introduced to. Wizards, witches, elves, fairies, knights, trolls, goblins. That's not to say that you won't see human characters, but for the most part, you are going to see one or several of characters that don't exist in real life, okay? Whenever I talk about characters, I always talk about characterization as well. Characterization is the way the author introduces or describes a character in relation to their looks, age, personality, thoughts, or speech. Now, when we have a story and the author is introducing a character, usually they will start to identify certain things about them. So, for example, if we were reading a novel and it talked about maybe an older woman that was 87 years old, she was only 4'5". She had large glasses and big head of gray curly hair, right? So already in our mind, we can kind of identify with what that character looks like. Okay. And we also can identify a lot about a character through their personality, their thoughts, and even what they say. If we have somebody who is coming across as thinking that they're better than other people, or if they're making fun of other people, that really helps us to identify or characterize that character and help us to form opinions about what we think. Okay. And we're definitely going to see that in our novel in regards to the different siblings. Okay. They all have their own different personalities and are characterized differently. Finally, we're going to talk about conflict. So when we think about that word conflict, usually we think of some kind of problem or some kind of struggle, okay? So conflict refers to a struggle between two opposing forces, usually the protagonist and the antagonist. So, our hero and our villain. There are 4 types of conflicts, such as man versus man. That might be when we have our hero versus villain, okay? You might also see this written as person versus person as well. So we have a struggle between 2 characters. You might see man versus society. So that's when we have a character who's going against social norms. Maybe they broke the law, okay? So they're going against a bigger group of people. Then we have man versus self. So that's when a character is having some kind of internal struggle. Okay, if you think about a character might be peer pressured into doing something, but they have that internal struggle of, well, is this the right thing to do or is this the wrong thing to do? Okay, there's something struggling. Maybe there's something that they're striving for and they're working really hard for. Okay, then we have man versus nature. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You guys are a little young, so I'm not sure if you are familiar with the Final Destination movies, but throughout those movies, we have our character or characters, I should say, that are having some kind of struggle with something in nature. Maybe it's a blizzard, maybe it's a tornado, like in Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy gets swept up. Okay, so we do need to acknowledge that conflict can come in many different forms, especially in literature. So usually what I would have you guys do if we were in school, for each chapter, you would be identifying the things that we've talked about today. For each chapter, you would have to identify the setting, what characters were involved, what was the conflict, and what fantasy elements were included. Okay, because we're not at school and we're doing remote learning, I'm going to have you guys focus on comprehension questions and focusing on, making sure that you're understanding what's happening throughout the chapter. However, I still will encourage you guys to be thinking throughout each chapter. Where is this taking place? Who is involved? What characters are involved? I'm thinking about, well, what's the problem? What's the struggle? And also, what in this chapter makes it a fantasy story? We will find too that not all chapters will include all of those elements. Like maybe we won't start off with a magical element or a fantasy element in the story. Maybe there's not really a conflict in the story, and it's just kind of building us up to our conflict or our climax. Okay, so stay tuned. Check Echo. I miss you guys terribly. Hang in there. All right. Bye.